Good morning. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm one of the vice presidents here at the United States Institute of Peace, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the USIP. We are honored to be able to host this meeting, this conference on the EU rendezvous for the Transatlantic Partnership in Global Security, the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy. Some of my friends in Brussels have given me the title of Honorary European because I spent 5 years in Brussels working in Hamre, living in Jezus-Eik. I had a great time in Brussels. I look forward to having this kind of discussion. I was there in the late 80s when we at Hamre, the other international institution in Brussels, were still planning how we were going to address, meet, challenge Soviet armies coming across the North German plain. This was still serious times. I was also there when the Berlin Wall fell, and I was there when the Soviet Union disappeared. And the NATO thought very hard about what its role was in the world. And as we know, it worked on some other things in the interim in the last 20 years. Afghanistan, Libya, Somali pirates. Today, it's very, very fitting. It's a little sad, but it's very fitting that the challenges we now face as allies between the EU and the United States remind us of the times in the late 80s, remind us of the Cold War, remind us of the challenge from the East. It's not just a challenge from the East, by the way. We were talking earlier this morning. There are reports that there are long-range reconnaissance Russian aircraft across the Pacific these days, this morning. There are other military flights coming out of the Far East, Russian Far East, over the Pacific. So this is a global challenge. We face it today very clearly in Ukraine. We face aggression again in Europe. We face violation of international law. We face violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a European country. This means we need to focus again on the mission of both NATO and the alliance between Europeans and Americans. So this conference today, which will of course have an opportunity to talk about Ukraine, is an opportunity to reaffirm, reassess, reconfirm the importance of this alliance. I'm going to hand it over to the ambassador, the European ambassador to the United States, the EU, to introduce the next stage. But if I were Mr. Putin, I would envy us, our allies. So I think this is a very important time. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here with you once again. Thank you, Vice President Taylor, for providing the facilities of this wonderful building and institute. I think it's the most appropriate place to hold this kind of conference. We do it for the third time, and we are very keen to continue. I think it's very important that we have a fixed rendezvous, and you know this is part of a series that we call EU Rendezvous, a fixed rendezvous where the right people talk about the right subject. And let me say very frankly, security is back. And we are back in Washington discussing how we can cooperate to ensure security of our citizens. For me personally, for all my team, this is a top issue. It was not the case a few years ago when we realized when I arrived here and we start discussing our priorities, it was clear that CSDP was basically nowhere in Washington, to be very frank. It's no longer the case. We have, through this conference and through many other activities, enhanced the visibility of CSDP, its importance in the transatlantic partnership. Let me also remind you of the fact that last December, the European Council, which is the summit of European leaders discussed for the first time in a comprehensive and deep way security and defense matters, and particularly what we can do more inside Europe to enhance our capabilities and our effectiveness in this area. In the last EU-US summit in Brussels, President Obama, President Barroso, and President Van Rompuy discussed many issues, as you can imagine, but they also discussed and reaffirmed their commitment to effective cooperation across the Atlantic. And of course, last but not least, Crimea reminds us that security should never be taken for granted, that our citizens deserve our full attention, and most of all, they deserve our full cooperation. This is the most important alliance in the world. We have a responsibility to deliver, and this conference is a modest contribution to bringing together those that in Brussels and here that do this most of the time. And I'm so glad to see so many colleagues from Brussels coming over here, so many colleagues from Washington and Norfolk, and so many friends in the different communities that in Washington deal with these matters gathered here today. I think we have an excellent program, and I would like to thank all our partners. They're all listed there: Atlantic Council, Brookings, European Institute, Carnegie, CSIS, and SAIS. This is the A-team of think tanks and thinkers involved in foreign policy, security, and defense matters, and it's great to cooperate with all of them. Once again, I'd like to recognize also the presence of a number of my colleague ambassadors of the European Union member states here. We do this in full cooperation with them, with their teams, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here today. My job is about to finish here because I want to hand over to, maybe the best speaker you can find in Washington on these kind of matters, João Hamre. It doesn't need any, where is he? John, you're here. Good morning again. It's great to have you with us. You've been cooperating with my team for a long time. It's been an effective cooperation. CSIS is, of course, one of the partners in our endeavors here. John has been with the CSIS as president since 2000, I guess. So it's a long-standing stewardship there. Before that, important places in government. You know all about him. But I think what is most important for us here today with John is that he is a great speaker. He is highly knowledgeable about all these issues, and I think he provides the best introduction to your work today. And then it's with great pleasure and honor that I introduce you, João Hamre.
Good morning, everybody. Let me really fill in the true story. The External Action Office here had a much more exciting keynote speaker who had to drop out at the last minute. And so my very good friends asked, could I sit? And I said, of course I would. I'd be happy to. I think it's a very important topic. Unfortunately, you don't get the best speaker, but you got me instead. But I do want to use this as an opportunity to share some thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about this question, and honestly didn't sleep last night at all. This is a very, very hard. I mean, I could give you happy talk, but I think we ought to have a real hard conversation together today. We've got three crises that are coming together in just the wrong way. The first crisis, frankly, is here in the United States. America is caught in a very difficult, unfortunate political transition. We are absorbed with our own problems, and we are confused about our role of leadership in the world. It grows out of deep problems in both parties. The Democratic Party has rediscovered its progressive roots and is deeply ambivalent about hard power.
The Republican Party is engaged in a civil war, and its traditional underpinning, being a party that defined itself as being a strong defense party, it is now deeply in question. The Republican Party does not commit itself to defense reflexively the way it did in the past. You see this now. I mean, I can't in my lifetime remember when Russia invaded a country and in 4 hours the American Congress divided itself. But that's what's happened. You know, we have a very deep problem here. And it comes at a time when we have rethought our priorities, and they're not in Europe, they're in Asia. I think you saw that last week with the president's rather forceful speeches in Tokyo and in Manila. You know, I mean, our highest priority is managing the rise of China. It isn't managing a petulant Russia in Europe. Okay? So this is a real crisis, and yet we cannot ignore this. So I think that's the first crisis that we have. I think the second crisis is frankly inside Europe. European Union has been in love with soft power and deeply ambivalent about hard power. You know, honestly, you viewed NATO as an insurance policy where somebody else paid the premium. You paid the deductible. Right? So you take the smallest deductible you can. That's what human nature is. And now we're seeing that. We had, I thought it was an embarrassing episode last week when the United States had to send 3 companies of soldiers to Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, not a single European contribution inside NATO. I mean, this is embarrassing. You know, and it is an opportunity, it's a fault line inside the Transatlantic Alliance that is being exploited. Okay? So this is a crisis. And I think the third crisis is in Russia. For domestic reasons, I think President Putin has embraced themes of Russian orthodoxy, values orthodoxy, and hot Russian nationalism into a very toxic mixture that is now finding voice in places like Crimea, maybe Ukraine, maybe Moldova, nightmare maybe in the Baltic states. Okay, and our response, to be candid, is pretty deeply ambivalent. You know, Americans are not mobilized as though this is the deepest crisis that we faced in the last 30 years. It is. And we are not mobilizing ourselves in a meaningful way. And there is a deep strain, it seems to me, within the transatlantic community. We have opted for sanctions because we don't know that we can generate a stronger response. Now, I don't think anybody feels that there's a meaningful military response to Crimea or to Ukraine. But there is a meaningful NATO response to reassuring and providing stability and security in the region. And I would argue this should be the focus for the European Union as well. I mean, the concern I have is that America really does not care. I'm a transatlanticist. I grew up. I defined my professional trajectory around the Cold War. I don't want a Cold War back again. But I don't want a Europe that's seized by a culture of intimidation. And that's what's emerging. And an ambivalence about standing up to it and dealing with it. That's what's emerging. And we don't have an effective response. I think that this needs to be the focus for the CSDP. I know that there are going to be other issues, and I want other issues on the agenda for CSDP. Europe will do a much better job than would we in developing partnership capacity on things like improving justice ministries in the world, promoting better and more competent domestic policing in countries. These are crying needs. And the EU could do a much better job than we on this, because there's an overlay of our military posture that would come in and infect that. That wouldn't be the case for Europe. And Europe should be leaning forward on things like this. But we honestly have to deal with this crisis in front of us. It's going to fundamentally reshape, Europe for the next 20 years. The idealism, the wonderful idealism that informs the creation of the European community and its development is now being challenged fundamentally by an 18th century vision of spheres of influence. And this is what caused so many millions of deaths throughout Europe in its day. And it's on our doorstep again. And it seems to me there has to be a more coherent response than we've generated so far. Now, ultimately it begins with a consensus within Europe. We should have a consensus here, but we cannot generate that because of our political pathologies right now. I think that this needs to be the focal point. Europe is too fractured and the voice is too small for what's going on. It needs to be larger, and it needs to lead us in understanding how to deal with the crisis. Ukraine is very far away for most Americans. We put it in the backdrop of our traditional Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union, but it isn't mobilizing action in this country. So this is something I think that the European Union needs to develop and lead in a new way to deal with this very long-term problem. This is not a 20-week problem. This is a 20-year problem. And we're going to have to start now putting down the deep taproots. And I think this is where I was very gratified to be invited, because the European Union's security agenda has not been strong. It's been sort of, in part we contributed to that. We were deeply ambivalent about ESDP when we call it ESDP. We saw it as a threat to NATO, and we did everything we could to undermine it, right? Now we're in a stage where we're not so sure we care. But you need to have America as a partner, but you need to help bring us back here. So I think this conference, and forgive me for being, I could give you a happy talk, but it would not reflect the honor that you deserve for your role here, especially with the External Action Commission in Washington, which is really doing a remarkable job. But it would not honor that role if I were not to be honest with you about this crisis that we're in right now. And it's huge. It's serious, and we have to take a more active role if we're going to deal with it. We're going to be, in this country, I think, confused for a number of years. Our politics is so self-absorbed for very different reasons. And so this is a chance for Europe to help redefine this transatlantic partnership. America will be there if we've got a partner that wants to lead. But we need a partner that wants to lead. Thank you for inviting me. I hope I didn't offend you by my comments. Thank you.
Well, I think now we have heard a message which is deeply moving, deeply stimulating, but John Hamre accepts to answer some questions which was not announced in the program, but this is so rare that I think we should use this opportunity. We still have some minutes before we go to the first session, so maybe 10 minutes of question, and maybe if you just want to stand up and identify yourself, thank you for asking your question.
Yes, please, Admiral. There's a microphone, please, sir.
Bob Tarrant, the Operation Commander for EU Atalanta, so dealing with pirates off Somalia. My question is, the three problems, I get that completely for a particular discussion, but there do seem to be now, in a globalized world, a lot more problems on top of that. So, in a sense, the way we have to tackle this is actually beyond the US and beyond the EU. Could you comment on that?
I agree completely. We have far too many problems than one set of leaders can handle. I think it's especially a problem here in this country, and by this I'm not making a commentary about the president or the leadership of this administration. It's a general problem. With America being a global superpower, we have the complexity of having to integrate 4 and 5 crises simultaneously. And there's just not the bandwidth to be able to handle so many deep crises at the same time. I've thought a lot about this. I think the only way for us to handle it is to rely on the institutions that we helped to build during the Cold War, so that there's a broader base. There are two kinds of internationalism. There's structural treaty-based internationalism through things like the European Union, we're not in it, of course, but through NATO, the UN Security Council, etc. And then there is consensus internationalism, coalitions of the willing. For a number of reasons, we got disenchanted with structural internationalism during the 80s and the 90s. It became a lot easier just to find partners who agreed with us, and we went off and did it together. The problem is that consensus internationalism or coalitions of the willing are not normative. They don't create the normative conditions that help you with the next problem. But structural internationalism does. It is normative. It establishes norms. That's the great challenge that Russia is posing right now, is they are fundamentally challenging the norms that have been established in Europe for proper behavior of nation states. You've systematically built this over the last 60 years, and it's now fundamentally being threatened. Well, it seems to me that means we should be putting far more focus and emphasis on the structures that we created and helped to create, the structures that help to modulate behavior and create normative expectations for other countries' behavior in the world. So I think to deal with this problem, you're right to have identified there are many problems around the world. One of the reasons that we're focused in Asia, and it's a higher priority for us, honestly, is because there aren't normative structures in Asia. There is no NATO in Asia. There is no EU in Asia. So to manage the complexities of the rise of China, we have to be there. And we have to play a very specific role. But in Europe, we ought to be falling back on the structures we helped to build. And part of that should be the European Union. The European Union ought to be part of what we count on as the structure to reestablish the norms by which international behavior will be modulated in Europe going forward, to include Russia and Russia's behavior. So we should be spending a lot more time. It's one of the reasons I wanted to have a chance to be here today.
Next question, maybe? Yes.
Microphone coming, please.
John, I'm the British Defence Attaché, Buster House. some have surmised that we have been distracted by the counter-terrorist threat. In other words, the attack on the Twin Towers, ghastly though it was not a strategic risk to America. It may well happen again. And actually the emphasis should still be on the Westphalian threat that you point to. Do you think, consistent with Admiral Tarrant's question about using international organizations more effectively, that we will refocus more effectively or in a more balanced fashion away from counterterrorism?
I agree with the premise that we disproportionately focused on counterterrorism over the last 10 years. I thought it was a mistake to launch the so-called war on terrorism. I mean, that's declaring war on a tactic, not a strategic problem. I mean, that would be analogous to saying World War II was the war against blitzkrieg, you know, as opposed to fascism. I mean, it was a mischaracterization of the problem, and it did warp the way we approached things. Overwhelmingly, our intelligence community has been focused on counterterrorism. It's been quite successful, by the way, been quite successful, but it has taken us away from a focus on other things. And I think we're starting to rebalance that. Now, again, this is a case where domestic American politics is getting in the way. I find it absolutely preposterous that the Congress is pursuing Benghazi at a time we've got Russia unhinging a European nation. I mean, what the hell is that? I mean, this is bizarre to me, to pursue a political agenda when there's a real-life crisis that's fundamentally going to reshape Europe for the next 20 years, and we're looking at Benghazi. I mean, this is a distortion, and it's again, the way our politics here in this country is warping the way we look at this issue. But to your point, we are starting to slowly, gradually rebalance ourselves, taking less of our resources on the counterterrorism and bringing it back to more traditional problems. But I would again say our focus is still going to be more heavily in Asia because of the lack of structure in Asia to deal with the problems. We have to be in Asia because of that. That's why we need NATO and the European Union more strongly involved in Europe.
The last question, maybe. Les trois coups, as in the French theater. 3 questions. The last question. No, not a third question.
Well, I apologize. I've missed the mark today.
That's anyway time. May I thank you, John, once again? And I think really, you know, it's difficult to recall all the good times of cooperation we have with you, John, since a number of years. I just suggest a round of applause. We are immediately, without stopping, turning to the first panel, which is, as you know, Reinforcing Transatlantic Security Cooperation, 2013 European Council on Defense and 2014 Milestones. Franz Burwell from the Atlantic Council did accept to moderate the panel, where we shall have Maciej Popowski and General Jean-Paul Palomeros taking part. Plus, is the first panelist coming? Yes. The third panelist is arriving through the steps, and you know him also because he's a very well-known Washington figure, James Townsend. James, welcome.
General, good to see you. Hey, good to see you. Hey, Fran. Hey, good to see you. Hey, good to see you.
So, welcome everybody. I'm Fran Burwell. I'm one of the vice presidents at the Atlantic Council here in town, and it's a real pleasure to be here. This past week, last week, we had a major conference on Europe Whole and Free, and I think some of the conversations from that, which looked at the way Europe is now facing some significant challenges after some years of real progress, I think will probably carry forward into our panel as we look at CSDP. I would start out by noting that this is a year of serious anniversaries. The centenary of the outbreak of World War I, 25 years from the fall of communism, 15 years from the first NATO and post-Cold War NATO enlargement, 10 years, of course, from the EU Big Bang enlargement, and also just over 15 years, about 15 and a half, from the St. Maio Declaration, where Britain and France got together and decided that the European Union should have a coherent foreign policy and the means, military and civilian, to back that up. So the question now, and of course St. Maio was really a response in many ways to what had happened in the Balkans and the EU's inability to address that in a military sense. And so the question today, as we face the shadow of Ukraine, which I think John Hamre so aptly described, is what progress has been made. And does the EU now have a greater capacity to reinforce its foreign policy with operations in the field? On the surface, it would seem so. There have been, I think, 31 operations and a couple more in the pipeline. Many of them, however, are civilian as opposed to military. We will talk about the utility of those two differences. And they're very small and often focused on training. Now, in the wake of the European financial crisis, we are also seeing cuts in defense budgets and therefore also, over the long term, capabilities, even cuts outside the Eurozone. Yet the demand side of these operations is still going on. It's still very much increasing. And in fact, I would go back to what Ambassador Almeida said about security being back. I think that we do see in Europe a far more dangerous environment than we would have even 4 or 5 years ago. Really a return of geopolitics. It's not just Ukraine. It's the possibility of a real dissolution in Libya. And of course, the possibility of an ongoing conflict and civil war in Syria and what might happen in terms of spillover with our NATO ally, Turkey. So this brings up a second load of questions. Not only what progress has been made in making CSDP a reality, but what kinds of operations should CSDP be undertaking? Because you don't know whether you've actually made real progress until you know what your goals are. And this, of course, brings in NATO, the traditional security partnership between the United States and Europe, which has been there for decades. And how does it relate to CSDP and the new challenges that are faced by both the United States and Europe? And I think, of course, this puts front and center the U.S.-European partnership. A few months ago, the only thing we actually talked about, as someone who does transatlantic relations in this town, was TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But the most recent US-EU summit was also focused on Ukraine. And if I had to say what we are doing, the two issues we are working most closely on right now with the EU, it's the TTIP negotiations and it's the negotiations over sanctions, more than daily contact. So security is back in the transatlantic partnership. And the question is, when the United States looks across the water, what do we expect from our two partner institutions, one of which we're a member of, NATO, and the EU? So we have a great set of panelists to discuss this. We're going to start with Maciej Witucki, from the European External Action Service. And I think one of the key things about this set of partners is, like, unlike myself, who is more of an academic and researcher, these are the actors, the decision makers, and the people who are making sure that things actually go forward. So Maciej Popowski of the European External Action Service, and he is the key person in terms of managing the operations that the European Union has in play and is planning. General Jean-Paul Palmeiras, who is Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. He is the top NATO commander on this side of the Atlantic, and particularly charged with looking forward in how military operations and military strategies may develop, and the challenges we will face in the future. And Jim Townsend, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Europe and NATO, who is, I think, the go-to guy in the Pentagon for all things Europe. I should also say he's a former colleague of mine at the Atlantic Council. So, Maciej, let's start with you. In December, the heads of state of the European Union met for this defense ministerial, the European Council, not ministerial, the European Council. It had been 10 years since the heads of state had had that on their agenda as a big item. And there was a lot of discussion going up to the meeting about whether it was the right time, given the financial crisis, to actually put that emphasis on it. But it went ahead. And why don't you tell us why this meeting of heads of state was so important, and what the major takeaways were, and in terms of what we should look for in the future. If we want to, over the next few months or a year, judge this meeting a success or not, what should we be looking for?
Thank you, Brian. Good morning. It was the right time. It was the right time, and it was also a culmination of several processes. I'll do a little product placement if you want to look at what has happened last year. There is a brochure outside with all the texts published by the Commission, the High Representative, and others, end of product placement. So it was quite a heavy process which sort of culminated at the December meeting. And as you said, it was quite unique because it was for the first time in several years that the leaders, our leaders, heads of state and government, actually did discuss. Not only did wave through conclusions, but they had a genuine discussion on security and defense. And it was after the Maidan events, but before the hot phase of the crisis in Ukraine. So the outcome of the European Council, in a way, was validated by the events. And the recent events have added the sense of urgency that we need to get serious about security and defense. We need to keep security and defense on the agenda for a number of reasons, you said, and John Hamre said that security is back because power politics is back. Right. It also marks, in a way, the end of a certain era, of a certain way of thinking about security in Europe. I mean, the very foundation of the European integration was the abandoning of hard power. We wanted to move away from hard power, from power politics. Well, it's back. So we need to come to terms with power. We need to develop our own capability to be able to counter politics based on power, which sends a number of messages to the European leaders, but also to the European public. You asked about the takeaways. I don't want to summarize the outcome of the summit, which was, of course, meticulously prepared by many of us, and it's quite complex. It's 60 so taskings given to the High Representatives, the External Action Service, the Commission. But what it boils down to is we need to continue developing European capabilities, military capabilities, and then capabilities are not labeled. It doesn't really matter whether they will label them EU, NATO, national, as long as they're available. And that's the problem. We were reminded that problem several years ago by Secretary Gates, and there have been several calls from across the Atlantic that Europe needs to get serious about its own commitment to defense. So we need to take it forward. We have a number of projects that would guide our effort. But more importantly, we have to hammer home the message that security is not God-given. And that was an eye-opener for many, though not whole yet, in Europe, that we've been concentrating on new threats, on cybersecurity or terrorists for all good reasons. But the old threats, the traditional threats, didn't go anywhere. They are just across our borders. So we need to be prepared to counter these threats, and we need to be well equipped to do that, which also means that investing in security cannot be seen as a superfluous luxury. It's not a luxury. It's a must. It's a hard sell in times of a financial crisis, but it needs to be done. So we have to be able to shoulder a greater deal of responsibility for our own security and the security of our environment, and our neighborhood, east and south. And it creates a space for real complementarity of efforts with NATO and with the United States.
Well, let me ask you, though, about the CSDP particularly. In this changed environment, many of the CSDP missions are quite some distance from Europe. Some are in Europe, one of the more historical missions, if I could put it that way, from the Balkans. But Atalanta, Mali, these things. Are you sensing a pulling back, more of a focus on protecting the European heartland, or is it really that the EU operations will take these small brush fires, take care of these small brush fires, while we still have to deal with the bigger questions that are still somewhat undetermined? We don't quite know what will happen in terms of Ukraine, for example, or Libya.
Now, first of all, we are not only dealing with small brush fires. I mean, piracy is a big brush fire. I mean, no smoke on the water, perhaps, because it's and this is a serious effort. But no, CSDP is expeditionary by nature.
Okay.
And this is not going to change, because we are not a defense alliance, and we are unlikely to become one in the foreseeable future. But when I mention the complementarity, and I know that the discussion at NATO now, and I attend some of these meetings, it's very much about NATO going back to its roots, which is common defense, deterrence, more visible presence, which is right, which again creates this room, space for complementary action in areas where NATO is not able or not willing or not capable to act. I was always very skeptical about the notion of a formal delineation of responsibilities. So that's for NATO, that's for the EU, because it always backfires, it's counterproductive. But when if it flows from the actual demand and supply,
right,
then it makes sense. So we'll continue doing things like fighting pirates at sea, but also engaging in capacity building on land. We will certainly use our competitive edge, which was mentioned by John Hamre, which is the civilian CSDP, where we are one of the very few service providers worldwide.
Yeah.
We can build up civilian institutions, we can train police forces and gendarmerie forces, we can develop justice institutions, which is badly needed. This is also something we are going to look at now in the context of the Ukraine crisis. It's not an immediate response to what's going on in the East, but it's a mid to long-term objective that needs to be taken care of by someone.
Right.
And there, Europe is certainly the front line.
Thank you. General Palmeiras, you have also a summit coming up in Wales in September. And so what do you expect when you look at the discussions that were held at the European Council, and you look at this stress on capabilities? NATO has for a long time at its summits, going in, talked about the importance of capabilities. And it has been difficult, frankly, to see a huge surge forward in results in capabilities. It has been a matter of trying to keep defense budgets where they are. I think now the United States is providing something like 75% of the NATO budget or the NATO defense budget, and many members are spending less on GDP than had been anticipated. I'm not sure that's a great measure, but it's there, it's out there in the public. So when you hear about the EU focusing on defense this way, and you're looking forward to your own summit, what are you expecting from the EU? What would you like to see? And how does that interact with what NATO is thinking about? And Maciej quite rightly pointed to this, I think, changed dialogue within NATO about more of the importance of defense as opposed to collective defense, as opposed to collective security.
Well, great questions that I will try to put in context, or on a lighter mood, perhaps put in context. Well, all CSDP's measures or milestones are important for NATO, obviously, and mainly because we share 22 members together. And in addition, we have a wonderful partnership between non-NATO EU members and non-EU NATO members, US, EU, or versus Sweden, Austria, Finland. So this is crucial that we organize those two summits with now in light with the Ukraine crisis. And obviously we have to deal with global crisis, very intricate. And so I would say EU-NATO cooperation is not an option. It's a requirement. So to be more precise, Ukraine crisis is certainly a game changer, but it reminds us, as it was said this morning, that collective defense has been for 65 years the major outcome of NATO, of the alliance, and it's still there, it's still relevant. And collective defense rely on strong political will on the one hand, on credible military forces on the other hand. So my first and foremost expectation today is that both the NATO, but as well the EU leaders, the same meet around the table, would it be for the EU summit or in Wales next September, they commit themselves to, I would say, face this huge challenge, which is the collective defense in the 21st century with strong political will and credible forces. So then, looking back in the last 2 decades, NATO, and I will certainly concur with your position on that, NATO and EU has been involved in many crises, more or less together. Obviously the Balkans, let's remind the Balkans, interesting case, if I may say so. Then Afghanistan, obviously, and then nowadays eastern border of Europe. We have a lot of lessons to share about that, and certainly I would agree that the first and foremost lessons is that we cannot delineate so much, we must not delineate the responsibility, because we know that the EU has a wonderful global approach, comprehensive approach, inventory. But on the other hand, we have seen NATO going more and more in partnership, and on the other side, EU, or at least EU members, going in a hard power as well, would be in Africa very recently, and in the past as well. So what I would say, the first conclusion would be a need for a more strategic, more common political dialogue to deal with the new crisis of this 21st centuries, and select better strategies coordination before we go into operational and tactical matters. And that should be based, in my perspective, on a common assessment. Now, if we look in the last decades, and I will not emphasize that, but it is striking to see how much complex, how much diffuse are the crises of today, how much they are interlinked, how much they are demanding, how much they happen very suddenly, and how much the EU countries have reduced their defense budget on very lasting, for the last decade at least. So there is a mismatch there, obviously. On the other hand, the US have kept a reasonable, more than reasonable budget, but they have many challenges to face around the globe. And this is the question. This is not so much a question of pivot to Asia. This is a global strategic question in my perspective. And then, in addition, you'll see a lot of nations outside of NATO who are investing quite dramatically, Russia, China, India, on the long term, and they have planned to keep on. So the imbalance, firstly, between the US, the gap between the US, EU is there, and the gap the internal gap, I would say, in Europe is even bigger than before. Between the few countries, the three countries, I would say, who spend more than 60% of the European budget versus the others who spend obviously 40%. So this is the second outcome of CSDP, the reinforcement, and it was clearly stated, on reinvesting in defense. So this is fine to reinvest in defense, but how? What should we do in reinvesting? I would say we must do that smartly. This is obvious, but this is much more difficult to say in full cooperation. And I must say that we have developed a strong cooperation, and I say that very honestly, very frankly, with European Defence Agency and certainly with Allied Command Transformation. We try to not only to deconflict, but to synergize capability development through smart defense, through pooling and sharing. But this is not a magical recipe against this enduring reduction in defense budget. So what we have to do is to regain some grounds, and I'm very happy to see CSDP reinvesting in, I would say, the major, or at least to mitigate the major capability gaps, like air tanking, UAVs, ISR. All of that is good for the EU, is good for CSDP, is good for NATO. But as well, reinvesting in research and technology, which will be so important for the future, investing in industrial cooperation, not only in Europe, but between the both sides of Europe. So I think this is the second outcome of the CSDP, of the summit, reinvestment, which should be supported by a greater transatlantic link. And lastly, this is fine to reinvest together in capabilities. This is fine to reinvest together in technology, but we must remind that all these technologies are useless without the dedicated, skilled, and well-trained people. And that's where perhaps I see the most obvious way in working together, in training, exercising, as NATO has launched its Connected Forces Initiative. We have a unique opportunity to do that together with European forces, because this is the single set of forces that we have all together. So we must train, and that will be good for interoperability, that will be good to raise the level of readiness, of responsiveness, to make sure that we can work, on the one hand, the NATO response force and the battle groups. On the other hand, all the tools that we have in the inventory, the European Transport Command, the strategic airlift, etc., all these tools should be more responsive and more adapted. Would it be under the NATO or the EU umbrella? It doesn't matter at the end of the day, because the political decision is the same essence. So, in summary, I think we have a unique opportunity through these two summits. The sequence that we couldn't imagine that Ukraine will be there, but we have a wonderful opportunity to take out of that, to develop those capabilities that we need, and for these two organizations which are so crucial for peace and security in Europe.
You mentioned the importance of having a shared assessment, because if you're going to reinvest, you need to know what to reinvest in. At Allied Command Transformation, you and your predecessor have often put emphasis on such things as cyber, energy security, quite rightly. I mean, it's your job to look forward into the future. And we've kind of been yanked back into the future, I can put it that way, by what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere as well. And there is this tension between security and defense of Europe and of the NATO space, and when it comes to resources, some of these other things that you're talking about. Yet there is also always the danger that you focus on the immediate traditional threat and you miss totally what is actually the next threat. How do you expect the allies to come to an agreement on what the threat assessment really is in September at the summit? How is that developing?
Well, this is obviously a great question, and we cannot allow ourselves a pause in transformation. And what Ukraine shows us is that we need more than ever to transform our alliance, and we have more ever to transform or to adapt CSDP as well and boost together. I mean, we have been working for a while on, as you say, on this global perspective on threat, risk, and opportunities, and this is the key for transformation. And I don't see a mismatch between reconcentrating a little bit on collective defense and taking care of the new threats. What are the questions today as far as the military perspective are concerned? First and foremost, protecting the borders of NATO, the borders of the alliance, the border of the EU. Fine. Secondly, taking part in crisis that we have done for two decades, sorry. And thirdly, the more and the more we have to protect our global commands, those lines, those safe lines of communication, which are the sea, the air, space, cyber, the more and more. And we can not do that in isolation. What Ukraine shows us is the comprehensive approach from our opponents, if I may say so, in how the way they deal with all this, they take the advantage of all these domains. So, and the only way to tackle that is to get an overall perspective, and I would say in three terms, in three main priorities. First and foremost, to increase together our situation, our strategic awareness. First and foremost, through more joint ISR, but as well human intelligence. To understand what happens today in Ukraine, we need more human intelligence than technical intelligence. Secondly, more adaptation, shaping of our forces, how we adapt our forces to the need. So that needs more flexibility, perhaps more mobility. We will not come back on the Cold War type of reset, I will say. We will still have to move and to take the best out of the forces that we are able to develop. More interoperability, more flexibility, more readiness, more responsiveness. And third, but not the least, how we maintain the proper resilience. I mean, resilience is the key today. Resilience because we have long enduring crisis, because we have reduced our resilience capabilities in reducing the budgets. And third, because everything is about resilience. If we want to be influential, if we want to achieve our aim, our public opinion should be resilient, our politicians should be resilient, but our military forces should be resilient. If you have to deal with cyber warfare, for instance, we must raise the level of resilience of our systems. Yeah. So those are the three key domains that I would see in the transformation, which is not contradictory in any way with the need for a strong collective defense.
Thank you. Let me turn to Jim Townsend for a U.S. view. Jim, we were reminded by John Hamre earlier this morning of how the U.S. took a somewhat dim view of the first parts of CSDP. When it first was starting to get off the ground, was rather concerned this would be a distraction from NATO. The tone has changed a lot. And in the last few years, I think we have heard basically a lot of go for it from the Defense Department and other places, that anything that gains capabilities or encourages capabilities is a good thing in Europe. When you look at the European Council in December and the results that came out of that, and you look forward to the NATO summit where we will be at the table, do you see progress in capabilities in terms of Europe, and especially when matched with the agenda that the General has set out? What are you expecting CSDP, what role do you see CSDP playing in this larger strategic framework, at least as far as the United States is concerned? And does Europe have the capabilities to do that?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something I'm working on every day. All of us are wrestling with this. But first, I want to say how great it is to see you and to have you as our moderator. It's a statement about this, how important this conference is that you're here doing this, because I don't think there's anyone in Washington that knows more about the EU than you, Fran. So it's great to be here with you. You know, it's interesting. I remember those early days of CSDP because I had just started in NATO, and the first phone call I received as I was unpacking my boxes was a call from Washington asking me what I thought about San Malo. And I didn't really know because I was unpacking my boxes, but I said, you know, anything that helps us with capabilities is fine by me. I don't look on this as something competing. It can be something that's mutually supportive. Well, this was in 1989, and that was not the answer they were looking for on the other end of the phone, and it set off about 3 or 4 years of acrimony between myself and my bosses back in Washington. But you're right, things have changed, and I think we've come around to understand that we need as much pressure as we can in allied capitals on both sides of the Atlantic about where defense is in terms of the priorities of nations. And so back in 1989, when CSDP was first, well, when Sao Paulo happened and they were beginning to flesh out what the military aspect of CSDP would look like, the concern was more that it was going to be zero-sum and that there was going to be competition and that the EU would go in one direction and the U.S. and NATO, or at least U.S. leadership within the alliance, would be challenged and potentially taking us in another direction. And I think at the time, the politics and the rhetoric being what it was, for the next few years, a lot of that was being debated. I mean, it was a serious concern, but I think we've worked our way through that. And sitting here with my 3 colleagues, I was struck when I sat down what a different feeling it is today than when I sat here last year with, I know, General Palomares, you were here.
I think you were probably here.
Mache, I'm not sure you were here, although I think you were in the audience. Even at that time last year, we were kind of an us, not necessarily an us versus them, but there were 2 distinct camps, and we were still involved in this choreography about, you know, how do we work together, particularly towards capabilities. What's different now is what's happened in Ukraine and what Russia has done has really put us all in the same camp, whether we like it or not. This is really a time now where we have to put the rhetoric and a lot of the, soft ideas or a lot of the more academic thinking about, well, what should we be doing? We're beyond that, and so we, over the next few months, really have to come together and answer your question, Fran, about how, if you look at what was decided and discussed in December as the EU met, which I thought was a very great step forward and an important one. It took a long time, but it was a major step forward to getting CSDP and the EU in a place where we could cooperate better. Working that summit with what we're going to do in September, where the EU has to be part of that. And I think that's one of the great takeaways from this situation we're in right now, is that we have to face what's happening in Ukraine, what Russia's doing. We have to face this together and unified. There cannot be a sliver of daylight between us. And I think, Fran, you mentioned a lot of work that's being done on the sanctions and this type of thing, which has shown on the political side we are doing that. And there's every day lots of conversations and meetings in Washington where we've talked about working together with you. And now I think on the military side, as well as we look at European security and the roles of these institutions, we really now need to make sure that we try to be as mutually supportive and collaborative as we can in moving forward, looking at European security worldwide. Mache said that the CSDP is expeditionary. So is NATO, and one of our challenges is making sure that we understand that we need to continue to be expeditionary. We can't be captured by what's happening in Russia and with Ukraine in terms of dictating what we're going to look like from now on. We have to do a better job now of bringing that into our planning and thinking at NATO. It's a reminder of the importance of security within Europe. And also, Mache, it's very much what you said. I thought it was just brilliant how you started off in talking about, as I interpreted it, there was a lot of wishful thinking in 1990, 1991, 92, as we were going through that decade of years. We were focusing on the Balkans, but the idea of power politics supported by a military, a hard military fist, that those days were over, as if it was a light switch. The Cold War was over, that light switch went off, and we were off doing brush fires and piracy and this type of thing.
Humanitarian operation.
We learned that just as you said, we can't assume that that's what happens. But we all were brought back to that understanding that we always have to have that in the forefront of our minds. And so that's what we're going to have to do. So at the summit, in September, as we within NATO make those shifts and changes in terms of NATO planning and looking at the kind of capabilities we're going to need, as the United States, in my office, as we look at our bilateral relations with the nations of Europe and what we need to be doing with the Baltics, with Poland, with the older allies as well in terms of spending and priorities on defense, a lot of that will be part of the summit. But I think there's other things that are going to have to be part of the summit too with the European Union. And I will say we shouldn't wait till the summit. I think as we look at Ukraine, and we look at Ukraine past the election, and we look at helping and supporting Ukraine in this time, the EU is going to be doing things. We'll see about NATO. NATO is trying to sort out what it will do. I believe this is something where we have to work together as best we can here, not with a division of labor. I agree with you on that point. It's divisions of labor put you in a straitjacket, and we all know, and General Palomar said this, when the real operation happens, you know, everything you planned beforehand about divisions of labor, it doesn't happen that way. But I think what we ought to do, and I'll throw out just a couple of ideas here. These are from my own. I'm not here.
It's not official government.
I'm not launching a U.S. balloon here, right? But in the traditions of my office and what I do, I think the EU Military Committee and the NATO Military Committee ought to get together. The NAC-PSC has met. Why not the two military committees, or at least the chairman of the two military committees? It can be done informally. It can be, but I think a sign that is very important in this crisis right now is two podiums with the chairman of the military committee from NATO and the chairman of the EU's military staff, military committee, standing there together with the two flags and talking about how, in terms of military reform or this type of thing for Ukraine, at least showing that we are talking, we're exchanging information, and that when the time comes for us to go in and begin to support Ukraine, that we do it in a collaborative way, in a cooperative way as best we can, understanding how both institutions operate, but this is a time now, a challenge now for these two institutions to come together and show that. I think as the two institutions get more involved in Ukraine in the future, we should do that together. I would like to see nothing more in terms of those two institutions are in NATO. They're in the same building with an EU flag and a NATO flag out front. They don't have to be sitting in each other's offices. They could be separated on two wings of the building. But the idea that we're in there together and that we're working this together, not only is it important to show Russia and others that they can't divide Europe here, but it's also, I think, a sign of understanding the fiscal realities we're in, and which is where Fran is going. How can we do this when in this era of austerity? We do that by working together because we can't afford to do it any other way. General Palomar has said that. So I would like to say, in terms of this summit, those are some areas where the EU can fit in with NATO, and we should think about that. My government does not necessarily support this, but this is where
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to questions now from the audience. And I see one right here. And do we have a microphone?
Thank you. Arwan Nagadek from George Washington University. A couple of questions about if security is back. The first question is to Mr. Popovsky. One of the anniversaries, the 5 years just about since we signed the Lisbon Treaty. Not to get too arcane, but one of the main innovations of the Lisbon Treaty was the Article 42.7 that sort of swallowed up the old WEU's security guarantee inside the fold of the EU. It is striking that that Article 42.7 is the one that should be the most salient now in the discussion about the effects of the return of security into the EU, because that's the article that says that if any one of the EU member states comes under a military attack, then all the rest of us are supposed to do something about it now. The question basically is, did we mean what we said back then? Is there talk about actually fleshing out what we meant by Article 42.7? And the other, I suppose, would be to General Paloméros and Jim, is if security is back, we can talk about transatlantic partnership as much as we'd like. There's been a couple mentions of informal ways to improve the relationship between NATO and CSDP. But at the end of the day, we will end up with the Turkey-Cyprus issue. Now, with security being back is not one of the potential silver linings, that it might be a reality check for the Turks to recall that the issue for them in their neighborhood is not Cyprus, it's Russia. Do you see the opportunity at least to try and go back to the breach and change, mitigate the theology of CSDP NATO relations at the formal level on the Turkey-Cyprus dilemma that's been plaguing us for so long? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So first to Maciej. What does the EU security guarantee really mean? What does the Lisbon Treaty mean? And has there been a real effort to try and figure out that and what it obligates the countries to do?
Look, every EU treaty, and that includes the Lisbon Treaty, has a lot of provisions that have never been used. And that's not the only one.
Yeah.
And as you know very well, this article is heavily caveated. So it says that those member states who are members of NATO, they would still regard NATO as as the main alliance, and this hasn't changed. There is no discussion going on now about making use of that particular article, and I don't think that timing would be appropriate, as NATO is now going back to its core functions of common defence. Of course, there are several members of the EU that are not members of NATO. That's a reality we need to accept. But for the time being, we are not dealing with that particular aspect of the Lisbon Treaty. But as I said, there is a lot of other provisions that we still need to explore how to make best use of them.
Right. Let me also bring you into this discussion of NATO-EU relations, because you mentioned you were out at a meeting at NATO, and I would say that 7 years ago, it seemed like NATO and EU officials only met surreptitiously in coffee shops around Brussels because it was so difficult. But it does seem to have changed dramatically, even though we have not resolved the particular situation about Turkey and Cyprus. So I'd like to ask all of you, do you see this as an obstacle now, or are we just getting on with business? And is this just the difference between de facto and de jure? And what are the potential roadblocks that you see to effective NATO-EU cooperation? Do they still exist, or should we really think that Jim's vision of the two heads of the military committees standing together is a realistic vision? So, Maciej, do you want to say a couple words, and then we'll turn over here?
Why, no. We meet so often with our NATO colleagues that we started running out of coffee shops. I'm at NATO almost every week, every 10 days, and we have a policy of cross-invitations. We do it in full transparency with our member states. They know it's happening.
Right.
So whatever we discuss with NATO, be it on military issues or civilian, cyber security, what have you, we always debrief, we always keep everybody in the loop, and it's fine because it's paying off. They are grateful. Of course, we have we have the underlying problem between both organizations. There are signs of progress, in particular now since the last meeting of the two negotiators in February, if I'm not mistaken. But it may take some time. But in the meantime, we've made a lot of progress. Since I took up my current position in 2011, I think the cooperation between EU and NATO has intensified enormously. There are a lot of exchanges. It's all pragmatic and down to earth, but it's bringing results. Now, Jim mentioned the NAC PSC meeting, which for the outside world, people don't know what it is. But for the insiders, of course, it's a major event, and we just had one on Ukraine in March, which we managed to put together in 2 days. Normally, it would have taken 3 months to agree on the principle. But because of the urgency of the situation in Ukraine, everybody was in agreement that we need to do it. And I hope we'll be able to intensify these exchanges, whether it's the NAC PSC, the military committees. It can apply to different formats. It's also a very good way of expressing the unity of the transatlantic community.
Very much so. General, I know you have a very good relationship and close relationship with the European Defence Agency.
Yeah, very much so. Well, first and foremost, to answer the question or the suggestion of Jim, the two military committee chairman, General Vossluber is there, he could discuss that even better than me, but they meet regularly, they have a strong relationship, they know each other. But again, when they meet, when they gather, which is their role, the Chief of Defense, they face 22 Chief of Defense who are there in the European Union, under the European Union umbrella, and then in NATO umbrella. So the same speech and the essence. When I came to ACT, one of my first and first priority, very openly stated, was EU-NATO partnership. And I said that at once. If we have a European, French commander working ahead of ACT here in the US, this is one and foremost priority. And I didn't hide myself, and that was put to the NAC, that was put to everybody to understand that that was an objective, but very pragmatic in respecting the rules, and because we don't want a blockage, because we are there to avoid blockages, so we have to move forward. I would agree on one point, is this is the unique opportunity to override this kind of blockage, which are a little bit silly because the emperor has to go further. In partnership, for instance, every day, every year, we have to rediscuss the essence of partnership and go through all the NAC meeting, etc., etc. And this is why the partners of NATO have not enough confidence in our partnership, because we cannot show them a long-term partnership, strategic partnership. This is one big issue that we have. Jim knows that very well. So I think we have moved quite a lot. I see the European leaders, when they are around the tables in the military or in the NAC, they are doing a wonderful job. And even with Afghanistan, with any kind, they are invited almost to all the meetings. And they really put a strong, very relevant advice, which is well taken into account. We have moved quite a lot forward. We have still some way to go, but really the confidence is there. And now we can speak openly of that, and we can really put things on the table, what matters, really.
If I recall correctly, the EU leadership was at both the Lisbon and Chicago summits. And I know that the NATO SecGen was at the Defense Ministers' Council, I believe.
He's coming to every defense
He
council
comes to
almost,
yeah. So do you see any official way of having the EU recognized within NATO or represented within NATO as an institution, as opposed to, would that be useful, or would that, am I focusing too much on institutional solutions rather than the practical politics?
If I could just mention, it's an interesting point that we've wrestled with since the very beginning of how the representation, because it's not just institutions and representation, but it's the practicalities of how we can talk and cooperate with one another. But I wanted to give you an example of how on a day-to-day basis we are talking to one another, and in complete transparency and everyone knowing this is going to happen. But I was at NATO headquarters a week or so ago for the U.S. Multilat, as it's called, and it's where all the allies do this. It was our turn to sit before the NATO committee and talk about the U.S. military contribution to the alliance. Well, it was not just the myself plus 27 allies around the table, but it was also the EU was there, and partners were there. And so they were there participating in one of the most important things the alliance does as an institution, and that is talk to each nation, ask questions to each nation about their contributions to the alliance. I mean, that's something that isn't well known on the outside, but it's the lifeblood of the alliance. It's the lifeblood of capabilities, and the EU was there. The EU didn't ask me any questions, although they might have asked one. But what was important was that EU representative went back to EU headquarters with an understanding of what the U.S. was going to provide to the alliance, how that fit in, and therefore had a context within which to think about the European Union. And I wanted just to add a couple of quick points. There has been progress made on Cyprus and Turkey and what's happening there. We just hold our breath and we hope that this is going to go forward. We've got very good negotiators. The political situation seems to be amenable to this type of thing, and we do hope that that there's great progress and that we can, over time, come to a resolution. I would say since Saint-Malo and all of this, there has been flexibility shown by a number of the parties involved with this. There has been the development of a working relationship between the two institutions that meet the requirements of the parties. And I think Maciej was he described it very well. It's very open, it's very transparent, everyone's debriefed, we all know what's going on, but it allows us to make progress on how our two institutions work with one another, but there's no substitute for what we could do once we get past the political issues and we can have much more of a formal relationship and do those things that we know we need to do. And if I may, just one quick point. Maciej talked about NATO going back to its core function, which is in terms of collective defense, et cetera. And I think I wanted to, it's a very interesting statement. I wanted just to give you my view of whether NATO is going back to that. The way I look on it is what's happened with Ukraine and with Russia has reminded us of the importance of that core, that core bit of NATO in terms of collective defense and European security, the territorial security of the alliance. We were reminded of that in a big way. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that we're going back to that, but what I will say is that through this wake-up call, we understand that you can never take it for granted, and we have to strengthen it. So a lot of what we're going to do now, what we're doing on a bilateral basis in the United States, what we're going to be doing through NATO, and certainly at the summit you'll see this, is going back and shoring up that aspect, because, the strategic concept has three core areas in which we work, and we have been in Afghanistan, we've been combating pirates, we've been in the Balkans. Joe Palomares knows better than anybody all the various things that NATO is doing, sometimes in conjunction with the EU. And I think really it's a matter of understanding that we've got to do more to shore up that bedrock of the alliance, which is Article 5, and the ability to quickly mount a pretty solid defense against any challenge coming to that.
Jim, let me follow up on that just quickly as far as the U.S. commitment. Because John Hamre was talking about the focus on Asia. And I run this conference, the Wrocław Global Forum in Poland. And of course, when I'm in Poland, there's always a lot of comments about the U.S. military commitment in Central Europe. Since Ukraine, there has been a lot more activity in that regard. But there was a lot of criticism before Ukraine about U.S. forces leaving. Is that now reversed? Is Ukraine put these forces back into a commitment to Europe and defending Europe, or is it just temporary?
Well, that's a great question. I will say that I get my phone calls returned now, and I'm invited to parties, so I'm once more popular in the Pentagon. But I think in terms of this rebalancing to Asia, I like to refer to it as it's really more of a focus on Asia that the administration has built now. And you see a lot of that reflected in visits. The president was just there. The Secretary of Defense goes there often. And so there's a lot of work being done in Asia in terms of talking to the nations there, developing agreements, and understanding better how we can all work together to handle the challenges in Asia. So that's really what that's all about. It is not something where forces left Europe or monies left Europe and went to higher challenges in Asia. That was not really how it manifested itself. It was certainly much more of a focus and attention and an energy that was dealing with how, as a group effort in Asia, how do we handle those challenges to important U.S. interests there? So in Europe, what's happened now is I think what we're going to be doing, and I'll give it to you real quick, because could be a long conversation. I see that there are three areas where, in terms of the United States, we're going to be reshaping and refocusing our efforts in terms of transatlantic security and European security. One is at NATO, where we're going to be working with other allies and trying to figure out what does NATO need to do differently now, looking at the challenges ahead, not just that challenge represented by what's happening with Russia and in Ukraine, but there's also the future challenges, too, that we still have to deal with, whether it's cyber, whether it's piracy. The Southern European nations have challenges, too. And so what we're going to have to do is try to find that balance, understanding going back to this core area about Article 5. The second area is what you're getting at, which is U.S. force posture in Europe. Are we going to see the brigade combat team come back? Are we going to be building bases? Is it back to the future? And I would say, no, that's not how it will be manifested. But I think what you're going to see is a lot more reshaping of the kinds of exercises and training that we do with forces already there. I think you'll see a lot more rotational forces coming from the United States over. You know, we've already have the 2 battalions that we're going to be coming through as part of some announcements we made last year. I'm hoping we're going to see maybe some more of that in terms of not just ground forces, but air forces as well. A lot of what we're doing with the Baltic air policing supplementation, a lot of what we're doing in Poland with the aviation detachment there, and maybe having a ground element to that. There are a lot of things that we're doing that I think we're going to continue doing in terms of making sure that we are ready to do the reinforcement, et cetera. And then the last bit is with the bilateral relationship with all the nations. We're going to be doing things with the Baltics and with Poland that I don't think we would have done a year ago. Things like prepositioning, things like shaped exercises and training that look at reinforcement. So it's those kinds of things that you're going to see.
Great. Let me go up to the very patient person there. We'll get a bunch of questions, and then we'll go around for a final round, because I think we're getting close to the witching hour. Yes, okay.
I'm Chantal de Jong-Oudhat from CIPRI North America and Women in International Security, also known as WISE. I have a question, and it's basically a question, I think, for all panelists. Many have said that NATO has to get back to basics, back to its core mission, that is focus on European security, focus on defense and deterrence. But my question is, does NATO really have the capabilities to do that, given the new challenge posed by Russia in Ukraine? Russia interjected small units, is trying to foster a local insurgency, and it seems to me that the traditional show of military force is actually not very effective for this type of challenge. Right. You know, battalions, show of planes, military exercises do not seem to be very effective. We cannot deal with those type of instruments with an insurgency like this. So it seems to me that the way to go here, or to deal with these type of challenges, is to really beef up national security forces, and there the EU might have a bigger responsibility.
Thank you. Is that a question over there? Or I saw another one here. Where did I see one? Yes, there. Wait, over one. You have a choice of 2 microphones. Thank you.
Greg Schulte, National War College. Like Jim Townsend, only speaking for myself, too. I would be more than pleased to see more cross-representation between institutions. I'd like to see joint meetings of the military committees, but I don't think those are going to impress President Putin. I don't think those are going to reassure exposed allies. Given what we heard from Dr. Hamre earlier, shouldn't we be thinking about things like Leopard tanks alongside the paratroopers from the U.S. that are deployed forward? I'm happy to hear what Jim Townsend has said about the U.S. rethinking its posture and exercises. What are the Europeans going to do? Thank you.
Okay. And did I see one way in the back there, up at the top? Can we get a mic up there, and that'll be it?
Hi, I'm Nicholas Blake. I'm graduating in just a few days now from American University, and I spent the fall semester in our Brussels campus. And I'm curious to see what the panelists' perspective has been on the recent trend in bilateral transatlantic security cooperation, specifically between the U.S. and France. Is this a model for transatlantic security cooperation moving forward, or has this been sort of an ad hoc substitute for greater cooperation within the institutions? Thank you.
So I'm going to invite the panelists to each take a minute and make some wrap-up comments. But I think we've got a good set of last questions here. One is, we're seeing a different type of warfare. Does NATO have the capabilities? Does the EU have the capabilities to counter that? And then a related question, if we're talking about the really hard security, what can the EU do? Has it finally lost its devotion to the softer elements of security? And then it's not just US-France, but there are a whole web of bilateral security partnerships across the Atlantic and in Europe. And how do they fit with these larger institutional questions? So, Maciej, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, on the countering of these atypical threats, one of the core functions that we've been discussing, core functions of NATO, is also deterrence. So that's why we need to build up capabilities to be able to deter threats when they get closer to our borders. It may not be, the capabilities we've been discussing may not be fit for purpose to counter a kind of insurgency that is taking place, but it's badly needed to protect ourselves. What does this mean for Europe? I mean, Europe needs to get serious about its commitment to security and defense. This is as simple as that. And Cathy Ashton has put it to the defense ministers, the EU defense ministers, last time they met in Luxembourg a few weeks ago. If you needed a reason to get serious about our commitment to security and defense, including CSDP, this is it. Yeah. What else do you need? Yeah. And on the bilateral versus multilateral cooperation, I don't see a contradiction. It is all networked. When we talk about cooperation in Europe, like pooling and sharing development of European capabilities, it's not always at the EU level that all 28 member states need to be involved. We're also developing a network of bilateral, trilateral, regional clusters doing things together, and it's very effective. And the EU institutions, in particular the EU Defence Agency, you'll hear more about it in the afternoon, are there to facilitate that kind of cooperation.
Great. General Collins.
Well, it's a very fascinating first question that we have, because in NATO we tend to see the other way around. I mean, are we still able to carry out these large, big, high-intensity operations? Because our forces have been involved in crises, as I already stated, in a very asymmetric way, counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency. And we have relearned, and we have learned a lot of how to deal with this kind of threats, would it be in Afghanistan, and we paid the price for that. In Libya, it was very tough, defending Benghazi, and so on and so forth. And in all the major operations, even in the Horn of Africa or in Somalia together. So I think if in any case NATO forces had to be involved in such an environment, which is not the case in Ukraine, because everybody knows that Ukraine is not a NATO member, and this is very important, obviously, in terms of partnership as well. So I think that will be the case. The real question is how we are able, and I say to build on these lessons that we have learned, and how we improved our interoperability, our flexibility, and how we can optimize that in the line, as Jim Thompson said, of collective defense. So this is a great question. How much repositioning we have to do, how much we should be able to move forces around. As far as the European contribution to this Ukrainian crisis, I mean, we must remind ourselves that many European countries have dedicated already forces. I mean, we had a great contribution to air policing, not only in the Baltic states, but improving situation awareness with AWACS NATO plus other nations' AWACS fleet. And maritime, in the maritime, we see more and more presence in the Baltic Sea, in the Mediterranean, and even in the Black Sea, according to the Montreal Agreement, because we have to respect the treaty from our side. And so I think there is a great will. So let's see now for the ground forces. We are moving, but they are already EU ground forces. I mean, those countries, the eastern countries, they have their own forces, which belong to themselves and to the EU. So let's move forward. And the last question about this relationship, the bilateral relationship, it is crucial. We see that between the US and France, this is true, US and the UK and France as well. This is an improvement in how NATO, how the EU can achieve their goal. This is good to see those nations moving forward, optimizing their cooperation, provided it is done under the umbrella of interoperability, and that we do that in a coherent way. But this is exactly what happens now.
Thank you. Jim?
Two brief points. The first, Greg, in terms of Leopard tanks and paratroopers along the border, we're working on that. The paratroopers are there. And the Leopard tanks, unfortunately, a lot of nations have sold those from their inventories. But that's one of the things we're going to have to get back to is actually trying to figure out what makes the most sense along the borders. And we are very much looking at that. And I'm going to head out to Stuttgart in about a week and talk about what that manifestation might look like along the borders. So, but to make a point though on the two chairmen of those military committees meeting, the point there is we have to make sure the Russians don't think, or Putin doesn't think, that Europe is split or the transatlantic community is split. Those two military officers standing there have a great there's a great sign of a unity there and a determination there, and to make sure that he's not emboldened to think that that there is a weakness within the Western community here that he can exploit. And that's the importance of those two meeting. Last point is that in terms of this new type of warfare, you know, a lot of that it's a gray area warfare that's more political than it is military, where that kind of warfare makes it hard to make political decisions. I go back to the deterrence point. What we have to do is to deter so we don't get to that point where we have this kind of warfare that causes such political problems.
Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you to you for your good questions and for your attention. I think there was a lot of good material put out, and we're going to watch to see if we have the two heads of the military committee standing up together next year at the summit. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to the distinguished panel for the discussion and to Frank Burwell for the moderation. And please join us 11 for now for the networking break outside. And we will start 11:15 with the next panel, which is about strengthening EU-US cooperation in the light of events in Ukraine. And it will be again with Deputy Director General Popovsky of the External Action Service and with the Assistant Secretary Nuland. Thank you.